We've all seen the discussion as to how expensive HBM2 is, but there haven't been many firm numbers attached to the per-card cost of AMD's decision to opt for the on-interposer solution. AMD's standalone MSRP structure for Vega 56 positions it competitively with the GTX 1070. It carries comparable performance, equal memory capacity, and similar target retail price, assuming things calm down for the entire GPU market at some point. Given HBM2's higher cost and Vega 56's bigger die, that leaves little room for AMD to profit when compared to the GDDR5 solutions. That's what we're exploring today, alongside why AMD had to use HBM2. Before getting to that, this video is brought to you by Synergy, the software that lets you share a keyboard and mouse between multiple systems. If you have limited desk space and multiple computers to command, Synergy removes the need for separate peripherals or a KVM and works as over-the-network software. Use our link below to get 50% off the Home or Pro version with SSL. There are a lot of reasons that AMD went with HBM2, of course. It's not just a marketing thing of, this is the new shiny object that we have, you should buy it. There are actual legitimate reasons, especially on the power front and power consumption with Vega architecture. We'll get to those in a little bit in this video, but just the basics here. For folks asking why AMD can't just make a Vega 56 or 64 with GDDR5, you can't just swap between the two different types of memory. It would require a new memory controller setup, a lot of things, really, a new power delivery system. So it's not quite that easy. They're really stuck with what they've got now. And there are reasons that they went for HBM2, but it is factually more expensive than GDDR5. So we'll walk through both of those aspects today. Let's start with prices and then talk strategy. AMD's pricing structure for Vega uniquely leans on bundle packs to help improve the company's value argument in a competitive market. MSRP is $400 on RX Vega 56, $500 on RX Vega 64, and then an added $100 upcharge in exchange for 2 games and some instant discounts. AMD's intention with this is to offer greater value to gamers, but clearly this will also help the company increase margins, move more Ryzen parts, and thus recoup some of the potential low or negative margins on Vega. This is aided particularly with game bundles, where AIB partners pay AMD about $29 for the game codes, though that is often waived or offered in exchange for MDF. AMD also stated desire to stave off some mining purchases with the increased bundle prices, as this would offset the value proposition of the card to miners. Since the bundles are sold as standalone SKUs and can't be broken by consumers, i.e. broken into different pieces, it seems that this is potentially an effective solution at keeping miners at bay, if that were indeed the intention. This move to leverage bundle packs, which is somewhat unique to both GPU manufacturers, is also mystified by complex economics surrounding potential long-term plays by AMD, with the company having already somewhat lost a bet on HBM2 pricing decreasing by the time Vega rolled out. In fact, price increased at least once within the past year, and Hynix ultimately failed to deliver on AMD's demands in a timely fashion, or an achievable fashion at that. In the meantime, AMD could have its outlook set on increased supply, driving down cost to build Vega GPUs. This might mean taking a slight loss at the beginning or running on slim margins for now, with the hopes of a payoff somewhere down the line. Part of this hinges on Hynix potentially coming online with HBM2 at some point, which would hypothetically reduce the cost figures that we'll go over in this video, but ultimately AMD also needs to reclaim gaming market share. Part of that reclamation process will be aided by gritting teeth through painfully slim margins or even losses at launch. And of course, there's a reason that Hynix couldn't meet demand for now. Part of it is that AMD is really their only large demand partner in HBM2, so they didn't have a whole lot to deliver on other than AMD's contract. There are 2 major costs with the video card, the ASIC and the memory, with follow-up costs comprised of the VRM and, to a lesser extent, the cooler, the PCB, and all the penny a dozen parts. Let's start with the HBM2 and interposer pricing, as that's what we're confident in. Speaking with David Cantor of Real World Tech, the analyst who broke news on Maxwell's tile-based rasterization and who previously worked at Microprocessor Report, we received the following estimate. From David Cantor, quote, "The HBM2 memory is probably around $150, and the interposer and packaging should be $25. We later compared this estimate with early rumors of HBM2 pricing from earlier in the year, and word from 4 different vendors who spoke with Gamers Nexus independently, all of which were within $5 to $10 of each other and with David Cantor's on-record estimate. This gave us high confidence in the numbers. Taking his $175 estimate of combined HBM2 and interposer figure, we're nearly halfway to the MSRP of Vega 56, with the rest of the costs comprised of the usual, the VRM, the GPU die itself, which we have no idea what that costs, and dime a dozen electrical components. It'd cost a normal person, for instance, about $45 to build the VRM on Vega. That included the $2.70 per phase cost for instance, of the IRF 6894s and the IRF 6811 low and high side direct FETs, about $8.80 for all 6 of the IR 3598 drivers, and roughly $4 on the IR 35217 voltage controller. AMD is a large company though, and would receive volume discounts. Even as individuals, we could order 10,000 of these parts and drive that cost down. So we don't know what they pay for the VRM, and we're not sure how many AMD ordered and aren't going to speculate on what their discount would be, but those numbers give an idea for what someone might pay if they weren't a major corporation. This primarily helps explain why AMD opted for the same PCB and VRM on Vega FE 64 and 56, especially given the BIOS and power lock on 56. Although Vega can certainly benefit from the advanced VRM, the necessity of it lessens as we get down to the lower end card. The increased volume from V56 orders could offset cost across the entire product stack to a point of it being cheaper to overbuild Vega 56 than to order 2 or 3 completely different sets of VRM components and PCBs. Regardless, we're about $150 in on the HBM2 and $25 on the interposer, putting us at around $175 for the cost of the memory system before the die or any of the other components. We did speak with numerous folks, including Cantor, on estimated GPU die costs and pricing on that for AMD and for the AIB partners, but the estimates were ranging massively, like hundreds of dollars of range, to the point where they were really just educated guesses. And without something more concrete to work with, without corroboration between all of these different estimates on record and off, there's no point in trying to speculate on them. So we do not know the cost of the GPU die. We're only focusing on the big thing here, which is what everyone talks about. HBM2 is expensive. That's how expensive it is. But the next part is, how expensive is GDDR5? Because you need a point of comparison there to make any sense of it. Ultimately, for GPU cost and yield, only really AMD and GlobalFoundries know that for sure. And so then the next question is, what about the GDDR5 costs? A recent DigiTimes report pegs GDDR5 at about $6.50 for an 8GB module, though also shows pricing for August onward at $8.50 per module. With the old pricing, that's around $52 cost for an 8GB card, or $68 with the new pricing. We do not presently know the G5X cost, but the cost of GDDR5 puts HBM2 at about 3 times the cost for an equivalent amount, without factoring in yields or the larger GPU die, of course. So this shows why AMD's margins are so thin on Vega. We also know that AMD is passing along its HBM2 cost to partners at roughly a 1-to-1 rate. They're not really upcharging on it, which is typically what happens with GDDR5 memory. There's no room to upcharge the HBM2 with Vega's price target though. Ignoring GPU cost and cost of less significant components, again like the VRM and cooler, we're at $100 to $130 more than 8GB of GDDR5 cost to build. This is also ignoring other costs like incalculable R&D or packaging costs. We're just focusing on memory today, as that's what we know with the greatest accuracy. Now that we know how much HBM2 and GDDR5 cost, it's important to talk about why AMD is using HBM2. They're spending $100+ more for the same capacity, so there's got to be a reason for it beyond marketing and beyond what they normally say. So AMD generally puts it this way. Like most of AMD's hardware, the company is looking at HBM2 as a long-term investment. They're looking at it as a long play technologically to try and get some kind of benefit out of it. But the real reason, the most important reason, is that HBM2 critically allows AMD to reduce its power consumption in terms of bandwidth per watt, so to speak, because GDDR5 really wouldn't enable that with Vega architecture. Vega architecture on its own draws clearly plenty of power, but without HBM2, it'd be a whole lot more. And ultimately, this is something we talked about with Fiji, with the Fury X, is carrying through Vega with an upgrade to the HBM now in iteration 2. And it's the same story. It's that using HBM2 allows AMD to lower their power consumption, and with their architecture, that is particularly required. It's a very specific need on a per architecture basis, where presently NVIDIA can get away without HBM2 on their consumer cards. But NVIDIA is in a much different market position. They have a much different architecture, and AMD built for HBM, and their GPU, Vega, is particularly starved for memory bandwidth without HBM2, or even with it if you run it at a lower frequency. So there's a clear need for this memory design on Vega. So back to the power side of the argument. Speaking with Buildzoid, we know that Vega Frontier Edition 16GB HBM2 pulls 20 watts max, using a DMM to determine this consumption. This ignores the voltage controller's 3.3 volt draw, but we're still at 20 watts on memory and no more than an additional 10 watts for the controller, so that's less than 30 watts for the entire memory system on Vega Frontier Edition. We also know that an RX 480 uses 40 to 50 watts for its 8 gigabytes of memory, which is already a significant increase in power consumption per gigabyte over Vega FE. Again, FE. The RX 480 also has a memory bandwidth of 256 gigabytes per second with 8 gigabytes of GDDR5 versus Vega 56's 484 gigabytes per second. The result is increased bandwidth, the same capacity, and lower power consumption, but at a much higher cost to build. In order for an RX 480 to hypothetically reach similar bandwidth, power consumption would increase significantly. Buildzoid calculates that a hypothetical 384-bit GDDR5 bus on Polaris architecture would push 60 to 75 watts, and a 512-bit bus would do 80 to 100 watts. For this reason alone, HBM2 saves AMD from a high power budget that would otherwise be spent solely on memory. This comes down to architectural decisions made years ago by AMD at this point, which are most readily solved for with HBM2, as HBM2 provides greater bandwidth per watt than GDDR5. HBM is effectively a necessity to make Vega at least somewhat power efficient while keeping the higher memory bandwidth. Imagine Vega 56 or 64 drawing an additional 80 to 100 watts. The world wouldn't have it. The world freaked out as it is at what Vega draws now, and it'd be one of the hottest cards made since the GTX 480 or the R9 290X. The Vega architecture is clearly starved by memory bandwidth too. Overclocking HBM2 alone shows this, as its gains are greater than just core overclock increases. AMD didn't have another choice but to go with HBM2. This was forced. Even though cost would be roughly 1/3 on the other type of memory, GDDR5, it just didn't make sense to use it. GDDR5 might be possible, but not without blowing power consumption through the roof or losing performance by limiting bandwidth. The alternative is just a lower performing card. AMD provided GN with a statement pertaining to choices revolving around HBM2, which reads as follows. AMD chose HBM2 memory for Vega because this advanced memory technology has clear benefits on multiple fronts. HBM2 is a second-generation product that offers nearly twice the bandwidth per pin of first-generation HBM, thanks to various refinements. As we noted in the Vega white paper, HBM2 offers over 3 times the bandwidth per watt compared to GDDR5. Each stack of HBM2 has a wide dedicated 1024-bit interface, and side note here, there are 2 stacks of that, allowing the memory devices to run at relatively low clock speeds while delivering tremendous bandwidth. Also, thanks to die stacking and the use of an interposer, Vega with HBM2 achieves a 75% smaller footprint for the GPU die plus memories versus a comparable GDDR5 solution. Finally, the combination of high bandwidth, excellent power efficiency, and a compact physical footprint made HBM2 a clear choice for Vega. We have no plans to step back to GDDR5. And AMD did end up going for 2 stacks of HBM2 rather than 4. So compared to Fiji, we're at roughly the same memory bandwidth as the previous version of HBM, just with 2 stacks. Technically, it's a slight decrease in memory bandwidth, but the architecture is different overall, so not quite that simple. Either way, AMD says no plans to go back to GDDR5. They do benefit from the bandwidth per watt category for sure, and that's ultimately the crux of this decision, more so than anything else, more than any future-looking marketing, more than any of the usual items that you may have read pertaining to this launch. It is lowering the power consumption for an equivalent amount of memory with ultimately a better bandwidth than they would have gotten with GDDR5. That's why HBM2 is used. As for cost, knowing that the memory system gets us up to nearly $200 as a starting point, it's inarguable that AMD has lower margins on Vega products than could be had with GDDR5, but the company also didn't have a choice but to use HBM2. It's not a good or a bad thing, it's just a fact. NVIDIA forced AMD's hand here. They dropped the 1080 Ti in March alongside Ryzen, therefore stealing some of the thunder from Ryzen, pulling in more sales because you really didn't have another option but NVIDIA to pair with those 1800X CPUs, and then they followed that with a 1070 and 1080 MSRP reduction. That's ignoring the current insane GPU pricing and just looking at MSRP, as that's ultimately where the two companies battle under normal conditions. AMD is able to make back some of these margins with bundle packs, where a pair of games can be sold to AIBs for $29, then to consumers for $100, despite the games presently at time of shooting being available for $90. They can also make back margin where Ryzen and motherboard parts help recoup some of the additional spend. Each motherboard sold is another chipset moved, and Ryzen sales go completely to AMD. Either way, AMD has to increase its GPU market share. fighting through early losses or slim margins is part of that, and the long-term play is clearly hoping that increased demand and supply will lower cost to build. So it remains to be seen how that'll play out. But this bundle thing certainly helps in the interim. So that gives us a starting point for cost. It helps contextualize what people mean when they say HBM2 is expensive. That's your number. That's how expensive it is. It's about 3 times more than GDDR5, give or take $20, depending on the GDDR5 market right now. And that's pretty rough for AMD's profitability. AMD is making a lot of plays here to try and recoup some of that. They're doing the bundle packs for one, and they're selling cards that are basically, well, they've got a couple different spins on the same PCB and VRM. That helps a lot too, because ordering more volume of those parts means you don't have to, one, order a special small quantity for Vega Frontier Edition, and then a different quantity for Vega 64, and then a completely different board for Vega 56. So you save money there. That's one of the other plays. This one, as a specific benefit to consumers, means that if you buy Vega 56, you do actually get a really good VRM. So that's a nice benefit, but it is also to help them reduce cost. Additionally, the company really couldn't have reasonably gotten GDDR5 to work on Vega without major drawbacks based on what we know of the architecture, based on, you check the power consumption yourself of the memory, at less than 30 watts for 16 gigabytes of HBM2, you can't compete with that with GDDR5, not with Vega. It's too memory starved. They'd have to go with a smaller bus. They'd do so at a higher power consumption, and it just wouldn't be a good look. It wouldn't be a good product that could compete. Now, it would be cheaper to make, so you might end up with another Polaris where it's just kind of another mid-range product rather than targeting some high-end. So AMD really was in a tough spot. They were forced to do this. HBM2 is not used because AMD is trying to be the good guy and further the market here and push technology. It's being used out of necessity. It would be nice if everyone started using HBM2 because, I mean, ultimately it is objective fact that it's just more efficient in terms of performance or bandwidth per watt than GDDR5. G5X is a different story. We're not talking about that. Don't know enough about its cost or anything like that. HBM2 certainly would benefit a 1070, for example, but the difference is NVIDIA and AMD have different needs. NVIDIA doesn't need HBM2 to get the performance it gets. Its architecture is different, and frankly speaking, in terms of market, NVIDIA doesn't feel the same pressure that AMD does. AMD is pressured into making decisions that are more costly for them or more risky, but that's what you have to do when you're trying to compete where you're 30% to 70% or whatever it is these days. So that's where it stands. There's your pricing. Anyone who is curious, there's why they used it. And as far as performance, we're doing more work with Vega 56 Hybrid, the mod that we live streamed recently, overclocked it quite high with the extra 100% power offset. 400 watts through the card, but did something like more than 1700 megahertz. That'll be fun content. Check back for that. You can subscribe for it. Patreon.com/GamersNexus if you'd like to help us out directly in this type of reporting, or gamersnexus.squarespace.com to pick up a shirt like this one. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.